Hi, my name is Alyssa, and this video will help you understand the key features of evolution that you could see on test day. These features are natural selection and its more modern theories, speciation, patterns of evolution, and finally, measuring evolutionary time. After watching this video, you will be familiar with the different modes and theories of natural selection, as well as the trends in evolution and its timeline. You will be able to answer questions that ask you to compare and contrast these different topics. Natural selection is also known as survival of the fittest, and describes how organisms with favorable traits will have greater reproductive success and transfer these traits to their offspring. To date, there are many different theories within natural selection, so we'll go through a few, starting with the first proposed theory made by Charles Darwin in 1859. In his theory, he stated that few offspring actually survive to reach reproductive maturity, but if an individual in the population has a chance variation that gives it a slight advantage in the environment, it could survive longer. This variation is then said to be favorable. Darwin also stated that if the trait is heritable, more and more individuals in the population will obtain this favorable trait, reach reproductive maturity, and pass this trait along to offspring, which would increase its prevalence in future generations. This level of reproductive success is known as fitness. Darwin's theory of natural selection has largely been supported. However, with modern genetics, some additions have been made to this original theory. The modern synthesis model, also known as neo-Darwinism, includes the knowledge of genetic inheritance and changes in the gene pool that was gained after Darwin's initial proposal. This led to defining the process of differential reproduction. Since genes are passed from parent to offspring, any mutation or recombination that is favorable is more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Over time, this mutation will be found much more often throughout the population. The opposite of this process also occurs, where individuals with unfavorable traits do not reach reproductive maturity, and these traits are not passed down through generations. Another change to Darwin's theory was to include a measure of an organism's success in the population. This is done by not only looking at an organism's ability to reproduce, but also its success in supporting the offspring and the ability of their offspring to support others. This is called inclusive fitness, and looks at the benefits of certain traits on the whole population, not just the initial individual. Some species demonstrate inclusive fitness by protecting the young of the group by sacrificing themselves, ensuring that the favorable genes in the young are passed to future generations. This kind of behavior therefore improves the fitness of the population as a whole. The last additional theory within natural selection is punctuated equilibrium, which states that evolutionary changes occur in short bursts, not as a long, drawn-out process. This theory was suggested based on fossil records that showed long periods of little evolutionary change, followed by a sudden burst of changes to the fossils. Natural selection has three different modes of operation. We'll use this graph to help visualize the different modes of natural selection. This graph shows a bell curve representing the different phenotypes within a population. The first mode of natural selection is called stabilizing selection, and acts to maintain phenotypes within a tight range, eliminating those at the extremes. For example, think about the height of plants. Shorter plants will be in the shadows and will not get sufficient sunlight, but taller plants are more susceptible to wind damage, which could cause them to fall over and uproot. Stabilizing selection ensures that plants stay within a middle range for height, and the extremes of short and tall are eliminated because they are unfavorable in that environment. The second mode is directional selection, which is caused by adaptive pressures that lead to the dominance of an initially extreme phenotype. For this mode, think about the length of a giraffe's neck. As the trees grew taller, giraffes with shorter necks were unable to reach the leaves. Therefore, they were less likely to have reproductive success. Through changes in the environment, giraffes with longer necks were preferred, and a new standard phenotype emerged. Lastly, there is disruptive selection, where the two extreme phenotypes are selected over the norm. Examples of this are the different sized flowers which are pollinated by different bees. Large flowers attract the larger bees, and small flowers for the small bees. In this example, there are no intermediate-sized bees, and so disruptive selection has eliminated medium-sized flowers, as they would be pollinated less frequently, therefore decreasing reproductive success. The formation of a new species through evolution is called speciation. A species is a group of organisms that can produce fertile offspring when breeding. Now, think about splitting this group in half and putting them in separate environments. Speciation occurs when evolutionary pressures in the different environments cause different changes to each group. Eventually, the offspring of each group could no longer interbreed because they had evolved into new species. Two different species are said to be in reproductive isolation, which occurs through either prezygotic mechanisms or postzygotic mechanisms. Prezygotic mechanisms do not allow for the formation of a zygote due to biological and behavioral differences between the species. If two species do not breed at the same time, a zygote is unable to form. Take for example the American toad that mates in the early part of summer and the Fowler toad that mates later in the season. Even though they are both toads, since they do not breed at the same time, there is no possibility of forming a zygote from these two species in nature. Species also cannot breed if they are found in different ecological niches, as they would never come across one another to begin the breeding process. If two species are very different in their behavior, their mating habits could be different as well, and therefore there would be no attraction between the two species. This would prevent the species from breeding and forming a zygote. For example, a male porcupine will urinate on a female to attract them. In what other species would this be considered attractive? Some species have very different sex organs, and so intercourse would be impossible between the two, and a zygote could not form. Lastly, there is gametic isolation, where intercourse between the two species can occur, but fertilization cannot, and therefore a zygote would not form. Postzygotic mechanisms allow for formation of a zygote, but lead to non-viable or sterile offspring. Hybrid incompatibility occurs when a zygote is formed, but it is unable to develop into a new organism. The mule is an example of hybrid sterility. Although the horse and donkey were able to breed and produce a viable mule, the mule itself is sterile and therefore cannot produce viable offspring of its own. Finally, there are examples of species that can interbreed and form fertile offspring in the F1 generation, but hybrid breakdown occurs when the F2 generation is infertile. Let's now take a look at the three different patterns of evolution. These patterns are divergent, parallel, and convergent evolution, and describe whether species are similar based on a common ancestor or common environmental stressors. Divergent evolution is the independent development of uncommon traits in a species with a common ancestor. These differences are a result of the different selection pressures from the different environments in which the species inhabit. It's hard to imagine that cats and seals are an example of this, but they are both mammals in the order Carnivore. It is only from their separate environments that they evolved to have such different appearances. In parallel evolution, different species with similar ancestral origins evolve similar traits over time. This happens because the two species are experiencing the same kind of environmental pressures and therefore need to undergo similar adaptations. Take for example the evolution found among plants. Many plants have similar but distinct leaves that have evolved in parallel over time, and these plants share a common ancestor. Lastly, we will look at convergent evolution. This occurs when two or more lineages not related by a close ancestor evolve to have similar characteristics to one another. To remember this, think of fish and dolphins. They have a very similar resemblance to one another, even though they are in two different classes. Because of their common aquatic environments, these species evolved similar features that were beneficial to both of them. We will finish off by looking into the timeline of evolution. Evolution is typically a slow process in which environmental changes cause changes to genotypes and phenotypes within a population. The rate of evolution is measured based on the rate of change of a genotype over time and is influenced by environmental factors. For example, in an environment that has rapidly changing conditions, evolution will occur much faster so that favorable traits are passed down until the species is properly suited for the environment. Once these environmental changes slow down or stop altogether, and a species is perfectly suited for the environment, evolution will be exceedingly slow because changes to the genotypes are not required. However, there are still random mutations that can occur. Today, scientists can compare DNA sequences of different species to determine how similar the two species are. As humans, we are most closely related to the chimpanzee, with whom we share over 95% of our genome. However, with mice, we share only 70% of our genome. This percentage relates to where our most common ancestor resides taxonomically. The more distant the ancestor in taxonomy, the less overlap in the genome. Scientists then look at something called the molecular clock model, which measures how recently two species have split off from their common ancestor based on the similarities in their genome. Now that we have looked at a few examples of evolutionary theories, let's try a practice question to get you ready for test day. This question is asking you to think about the different theories presented in this video, and use them when thinking about how these birds adapted to their environment. The answer is D, directional selection. Remember that directional selection occurs when a species has environmental stressors that promote extreme phenotypes, like the birds who have the very large eyes. This is an example of natural selection, so answer choice A is not specific enough of an answer to be correct. Answer choices B and C are incorrect because we are not comparing two species to one another, as these patterns of evolution do. Great job if you got that question correct. In this video, we learned a number of new terms in regards to evolution. We looked at natural selection, which is the theory that favorable characteristics increase reproductive success and are passed down through generations. We looked at Darwin's initial theory, and then the more modern additions to it, like inclusive fitness, which measures an organism's fitness based on its success supporting its offspring, and punctuated equilibrium, which showed that evolutionary changes occur in rapid bursts. We saw the different modes of natural selection and provided examples for each: the preference of the normal phenotype of mid-size height plants in stabilizing selection, the increased prevalence of the extreme phenotype of long giraffe necks for directional selection, and the occurrence of both extreme phenotypes of large and small flowers in disruptive selection. We also looked at speciation, which is the formation of a new species through evolution, and looked into how reproductive isolation occurs. Finally, we explored the different patterns of evolution, and looked at each in regards to common ancestors and environmental pressures.
Thank you for watching this video, and good luck studying for your MCAT.